Switch. Cool. What got you into cars?
I mean, I've been into cars long before I could drive. I've been obsessed with cars probably before I could walk. My paternal grandfather was a car guy, so he was always talking about cars probably from when I was an infant. I remember at 4 or 5 that he sat me in the lap of his Lincoln and let me steer, and he worked the pedals. I had Matchbox and Corgi cars, and when I could read, I read every car magazine. It's just always been a passion. Can't really explain why that is, but long before I could drive, I could tell you every statistic and name every car. It's in my blood.
What was your first car?
Hilariously, and by pure coincidence, my first car was a 1987 Dodge Shadow Turbo, which just a couple years later in '89, the Shadow formed the basis for the CSX. And the reason that I bought the Shadow Turbo is I poured through all the car magazines, and for the amount of money I had and for what insurance would cost, Shadow Turbos then in '87 would go 7.7 seconds 0 to 60, and it was the fastest 0 to 60 I could afford. So that's what I bought. That's a
That's crazy. And then you kind of talked about it. What was the second car after that?
Traded that car for an Isuzu Impulse Turbo, and for the same reason, the Impulse Turbo would go 6.7 seconds 0 to 60 and would go 130 miles an hour, which is pretty extreme top speed then. Now a 5-liter Mustang had a higher top speed, but I couldn't afford the insurance on a 5-liter Mustang, so I bought the Impulse.
You talk a lot about high speeds actually, and a lot of people are like, oh, top speed doesn't matter, it's about how your car hits a corner. Just hitting top speed in your cars, what does that mean to you?
Well, top speed certainly matters for what I use the cars for. We talked about it. I mean, when you're going at your top speed and another car passes you like you're not moving, that's not a great feeling.
Is there a car that you have not been able to acquire that you want to add to this collection?
Oh yes. Oh yes. I would love to own any Ferrari that ran in the original Mille Miglia before they stopped running it in 1957. And more than anything else, I'd love to own a very early Ferrari 250 GT long wheelbase California Spider. But any of these cars that we're talking about are 8-figure cars. And at the risk of sounding a braggart, there's I'm sure most people who watch this will say, well, you own 7-figure cars, clearly you can buy anything you want. But it's actually not true. There is a big difference in the level of wealth it takes to own 7-figure cars and the level of wealth it takes to own 8-figure cars. And I'm just not there. But yes, early sports and racing Ferraris, especially the California Spiders, or the cars that actually ran the Mille Miglia, yeah, I covet those cars tremendously. Which is not to say that I don't recognize my good fortune, because I'm sitting in front of a 57 Ferrari 250 that I'm gonna run on the California Mille this year, and that's eligible for everything. Yeah, so the thing about this 1957 Ferrari 250 GT long wheelbase is this car was built very early in the company's history. They've been in business a little over 10 years. This car's chassis number 885, and they only used the odd numbers, and they didn't use every single one, which means in Ferrari's entire history, they made something less than 440 cars when this car was made. They were only making, in the neighborhood of 50 cars a year at that point. But this car is illustrative of what made Ferrari the famous brand that it is today, because you had a choice of gearing, but with the long gears, these cars would go 160 miles an hour in 1957, which was, just unheard of.
It's hard for cars to do that now.
Yeah, and I haven't had it that fast because we're getting the gearing sorted on this car. But I have had it at 220 kilometers an hour at redline in fourth gear at 7,000 RPM in fourth gear, 7,000 RPM motor in 1957.
From a V12.
V12 3 two-barrel levers. And at that speed, the car feels like you're barely moving. It's absolutely planted, it's absolutely stable. Another 30 miles an hour, which is what they'd be good for, because that's roughly 130 miles an hour, would be no problem at all. I mean, the chassis is so good. And that's what it's very much, in fact, this generation of 250 that put Ferrari on the map, that just won everything. I mean, Ferrari was winning races before, but these cars just won everything everywhere. And of course, the 250 long wheelbase, which is what this is, evolved into the short wheelbase, which evolved into the 250 GTO, which is the last one sold at auction was, I think, over $50 million for a 250 GTO. They're just world-beating cars, and they put Ferrari on the map.
So in terms of your collection, like getting this one, that one, where does it fall in your collection?
So I bought this car because I like to get the cars out and let people see them and use them the way they're intended. So I'd taken the ACA Bristol, we talked about this on the California Melee, and they are very good cars. But coming out of Joshua Tree National Park, we're going through a place in California called Box Canyon, where the road is straight, you're down in a canyon, so there's no cross streets, there's cliffs on both sides, you can see to the horizon. So I'm going absolutely as fast as that AC will go. Red line in fourth gear, will not go any faster. And 250 GT Tour de France, very much like this one, passed me while I was going at my top speed, like I wasn't moving. So I said to myself, I love Ferraris, and I need a Ferrari 250, because remember that rally's limited to 1957 or prior. I needed a Ferrari 250 for next year just to have the experience. There are 9 original 250 Tour de France.
I'd like to apologize. I have no idea why I decided to move the camera here while he was talking mid-sentence. I don't know why. This was a couple months ago. The girlfriend just broke up with me. Who knows if I was thinking straight? I have no idea. I'm sorry. Back to the video.
And those cars run, depending on how original they are and how good their race history is, they run anywhere between $7 and $11 million. This car, chassis 885, is not one of the original 9. It's a real 57 250, but it's complete Bitsa. It was originally bodied by a company called Elena. Ferrari didn't build their own bodies at that time. By 1961, it had lost its V12 motor and was powered by a Ford V8. That Ford V8 was actually an early prototype Cobra engine, and it eventually lost that motor. Presumably even that became too valuable. And by the 80s, it was being used quarter-mile drag racing in New Jersey with a Ford 351 Windsor. Eventually, by the late 80s, it was a completely derelict chassis with no glass, not much interior, rusty body, and it was basically left to rot. It was, as many of these cars are, because they're all old racing cars, this car was restored using the chassis, suspension, brakes, and instruments from 885, from the original chassis. It's now got the engine from a different 57 250, number 0695. And it's got a body that was built in the late 1950s as a replacement body for one of the 9 original Tour de France, 0707. That car was wrecked racing by a guy called Michel Renoir. Unfortunately, Renoir fell on financial hard times and never picked up the new body. nobody at that point or ever was building bodies not for a specific car. So the body wound up being purchased by a Ferrari dealer in Chicago called Joe Marchetti, and he displayed it as wall art for some time. And eventually the body, the engine, and the chassis were all purchased separately and made it together to make the car as you see it here today. So it's all real 1950s Ferrari, but it's what in the Italian car world we call it bizza, because it's made of bits of this and bits of that. And as a result, it will sell at a tremendous discount to one of the 9 original cars, but it will drive, of course, exactly the same and get you into all the same events. And it's all real. I don't do replicas or recreations. I have no interest. But I don't see any problem with assembling a pile of vintage parts to make one good car out of, the remnants of 3 bad cars.
Do you have any special stories with any of these vehicles, or in your collection, like very unique stories that happen?
I mean, yes. And pretty much every car in this collection has some unique story. And the stories range from automotive focused. This Dino 308 GT4, I drove it in 1998 on the New England 1000. It was the first 1,000-mile vintage rally I'd ever participated in. And we won the rally outright. So that was a pretty cool thing to do. There are the AC Bristol that's not here right now. I ran in this year's California Melee, another 1,000-mile vintage rally. Then I drove it home from California back to Maryland on the old Lincoln Highway route. And there's 2 amazing stories about that. I guess the coolest is I run it in a 1,000-mile vintage rally. I then drive it home on the Lincoln Highway across America. When I started that journey, the car had 4,000 miles on it. The odometer had been reset when it was restored. And somehow it turned 10,000 miles, passing through the Gettysburg National Monument on the Lincoln Highway. I mean, I don't know exactly what it means, but that's gotta mean something.
It means something.
How do you drive the Lincoln Highway home and turn 10,000 miles at Gettysburg? I mean, precisely in front of the monument. And, so that was amazing. And then another amazing story with that car is, like most of my cars actually, top speed is at red line in top gear. Top speed is limited by red line. I'll let you go a little faster if you ignore the red line. That car made it home, but the top ring was literally missing on 2 of the pistons when I got home. Not in the oil pan. Don't know, I guess it crumbled up enough to get blown out the exhaust. So we ran that car going across Nevada on US Route 50. We literally spent a minimum of 10 hours at top speed at red line in top gear. US 50 is called the loneliest road in America for a reason. I mean, you just don't see other cars. There's no intersections. There's 140 miles between gas stations. And that little car, I mean, it spent so much time at redline. Yes, it needed an engine rebuild when we got home, but it made it home and it was still running fine. So yeah, I suppose that's, another wonderful story. Funny story once, I was working in Manhattan and left Manhattan in a suit and tie on a very hot day in this Dino with no air conditioning, and got stuck in traffic, and I was absolutely baking in the sun. It's like a terrarium in there. And so I had stripped down to my underwear. And I was driving it to drop it off at a shop I used and pick up a different Ferrari and keep driving it home, a 69 365 GT. I'm driving that other Ferrari home, still in my underwear. I put my clothes in the boot because it didn't have air conditioning either. And I pull out legally in a marked passing zone. I pull out to pass a school bus, and just as I'm pulling back in, at red line in 4th gear, so about 140, 145 miles an hour, New York State trooper crests the hill going the other way. So I see him, I didn't even wait. I just pulled over. He goes down the road, makes a U-turn, presumably takes about 5 or 10 minutes, but eventually pulls in behind me. He walks up to my window and he says, do you know why I pulled you over? I said, you didn't pull me over. I saw you coming the other way, so I stopped. He says, okay. And why don't you have any clothes on? And I said, well, you see, I was driving a different Ferrari. And he says, no, you know what? I don't want to know. Slow down. And he walks back to his cruiser and drives away. So those are some fun stories.
That's actually hilarious. All right, so what is the inspiration behind the collection?
Well, the basic inspiration was just a love of cars. I didn't intend to create this collection, the Straylight Collection. I just knew I wanted to own cool cars, and the cars I thought were cool, we've talked about this a little bit, were the cars that were the vision of a single driven megalomaniac.
Yeah.
So the first collectible car I bought was this Ferrari Dino. I bought that in 1996 for the then grand sum of $19,000. And I bought that with my first bonus, and I didn't have any other money. I mean, I was eating ramen noodles and I owned a Ferrari. But the Ferraris made in that period, when Enzo Ferrari still had real control of the company, they were as close as you could get to sports racing cars and still drive them on the street. This car, the Dino, is tube frame, mid-engine, 4-wheel double wishbone suspension, all alloy 4-cam V8, 4 2-barrel Webers, no emissions equipment, no power steering, no air conditioning, just the bare minimum. And these cars were relatively successful in racing. Luigi Canetti's NART, North American Racing Team, fielded Le Mans entry of this very car. So I just wanted something Ferrari built when Enzo Ferrari was controlling the company, and this was the cheapest one that I could find, so I bought it. Having owned it, it occurred to me I wanted to own other cars like that. So I bought not just other Ferraris, but other cars built by similar individuals. And we've talked about this a little bit. The Shelby CSX, the Callaway twin turbo Corvette. And from there, I started being offered really unique cars, concept cars and prototypes. And I thought, wow, it's not just cars built by visionary individuals, the cars themselves can be visionary. And that kind of shifted the focus of the collection more towards one-offs, concept cars and prototypes, as opposed to just historically important sports and racing cars, or sports and racing cars built by driven, unique individuals.